There is a moment in military history that strategists still study with awe, more than 2,000 years after it took place. It was the year 216 before Christ, and the Roman army was advancing across the plains of Cannae in southern Italy with 86,000 soldiers. On the other side of the field waited Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, with a little more than half that number, just over 40,000 men. By any ordinary calculation, Rome should have crushed Carthage that day. The Roman consuls, Aemilius Paulus and Terentius Varro, knew the numbers. They had the numerical advantage. They had the morale. They had the reputation of an empire that had conquered most of the known Mediterranean world. And yet, by the end of that August day, 70,000 Romans lay dead on the ground, including one of the two consuls, 80 senators, and a third of Rome's entire ruling class. It was one of the greatest military defeats in all of recorded human history. And it was caused not by a larger army, not by superior weapons, not by some supernatural force. It was caused by a simple, devastating principle that most people never truly learn. The absolute concentration of force at the right point, at the right moment. Hannibal did not scatter his soldiers across the field, trying to cover every possible threat. He did the opposite. He deliberately pulled back his center, creating a concave formation, like a cup. The Romans advanced toward what appeared to be weakness, and then the two wings of the Carthaginian army closed in, like the fingers of an enormous hand, completely enveloping the Roman force. The Romans were so compressed they could barely raise their arms to fight. They outnumbered the enemy, but they could not use their numbers. Hannibal had concentrated lethal force at the only point that mattered, the containment of the flanks, and used that to turn the enemy's numerical superiority into a disadvantage. This is Law 23 of the 48 Laws of Power, as Robert Greene articulates it. Concentrate your forces. But understanding the law this way, merely as a military tactic, is to miss nearly everything it has to offer. Because what Hannibal did on that plain was not just battlefield tactics. It was a philosophy of power that repeats itself with astonishing consistency throughout all of human history. In wars, in business, in art, in science, and in the lives of individuals who build something truly lasting. And the reason most people never learn it is that it demands something that goes against a deeply human impulse: the need to protect yourself on all fronts at once, to leave no flank exposed, to diversify, to adapt to everything, to never bet everything on a single place. That impulse feels prudent. It feels mature. It feels like what a responsible adult should do. And in many cases, it leads directly to mediocrity or to defeat. Think about what happens when sunlight falls directly onto a piece of paper. Nothing. The paper warms slightly, perhaps. But if you take a magnifying glass and focus that exact same amount of light onto a single tiny point, the paper catches fire. The energy did not increase. What changed was only the focus. And that is the heart of Law 23. The same quantity of energy, of talent, of resources, of attention, concentrated at a single point, produces a qualitatively different result than that same energy scattered in multiple directions. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a literal description of how power works. Let us turn to an example that may be the most instructive in the entire history of business. In the early 19th century, the Rothschild family was neither the largest nor the wealthiest banking family in Europe. There were far more established financial institutions, with more capital, more connections, more prestige. But the Rothschilds had something no one else had: 5 sons strategically positioned in the 5 principal financial centers of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. And more importantly, a communication network faster than any government or rival bank. While other banks tried to do everything, financing wars, speculating in commodities, lending to retailers, managing inheritances, the Rothschilds chose to concentrate. They concentrated on what they did best: financing governments in moments of crisis, when the risk was enormous and the rewards equally so. The most famous story about them, one you have almost certainly heard, is that of Waterloo. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, Nathan Rothschild in London already knew the outcome before any European government did, thanks to his network of couriers. While everyone else awaited the result, which would determine the price of all British bonds, Nathan arrived at the London Stock Exchange and began to sell. Calmly, systematically, selling. The other investors saw this and drew the obvious conclusion: if Rothschild is selling, Napoleon has won. And they began to sell as well, in panic. Bonds plummeted. Then, at the precise moment, Nathan's agents began buying everything they could at rock-bottom prices. When the real news arrived, the British victory, prices exploded. The Rothschilds multiplied their fortune in a single day. But the point I want to emphasize is not merely the cleverness of the move. It is what made the move possible. Decades of absolute concentration on a single competitive advantage: the speed of information. While rivals diversified and tried to be everywhere, the Rothschilds deepened one single capability until it became insurmountable. This connects to something the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, borrowing from the Greek poet Archilochus, described in a distinction that became famous. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Berlin used this distinction to talk about types of thinkers, but it applies with equal precision to strategists, to entrepreneurs, to artists, to anyone seeking to build something real. The fox is versatile, adaptable, curious, capable of pursuing many objectives at once. The hedgehog has a single answer to every problem, and that answer is devastatingly effective precisely because it is so concentrated. In most high-stakes contests, the hedgehog wins. Michelangelo is another extraordinary case through which to examine this. In the Florentine Renaissance, artists were expected to be versatile: painting, sculpture, architecture, poetry, music. And many were. Leonardo da Vinci is the supreme example of the universal man, and it is entirely legitimate to admire him for it. But there is something interesting in the comparison between Leonardo and Michelangelo. Leonardo left a surprising number of unfinished projects. The dispersion of interest, which produced genius in many directions, also produced incompleteness. Michelangelo, by contrast, concentrated with an almost frightening intensity. He spent 4 years painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, alone, in a physically agonizing position, refusing assistance, refusing rest. When asked how he sculpted, his answer was famous: "I simply remove everything that is not the angel." That answer is not merely poetic. It is the precise description of a principle. You do not create power by adding. You create it by removing everything that is not the essential point. And here lies the paradox that Law 23 confronts directly. Dispersion looks like growth. When a company begins expanding into new markets, it seems to be growing. When a professional accumulates multiple certifications in different fields, it seems like they are increasing their value. When a leader tries to solve all of their team's problems simultaneously, it appears they are being efficient. But there is a point, and this point exists in every single one of these cases, where dispersion stops generating growth and begins generating vulnerability. Supply lines stretch too thin. Focus fragments. Excellence dilutes into average competence. And then the adversary, who concentrated their resources at a single point, strikes exactly there, and finds no real resistance, because the defense was scattered as well. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this deeply, at least during the golden period of his career. His doctrine of war was built on a principle he called concentration of force at the decisive point. He did not try to win on every front at once. He identified where the enemy was most vulnerable and launched a disproportionate mass of force there, with enough speed to break through before the enemy could redistribute their resources. The magnifying glass over the paper again. But what is most revealing in Napoleon's story is what happened when he abandoned that principle. When he invaded Russia in 1812 with 600,000 men, he tried to cover too many borders, conquer too many objectives, sustain an impossible supply line across an impossible expanse of territory. The army was not defeated in a decisive battle. It simply dissolved, consumed by its own extension. When you try to be strong everywhere, you are strong nowhere.
This has a direct and profound application in contemporary life that is worth examining carefully. We live in a historical moment in which the dispersion of attention has been elevated to the status of virtue. We are bombarded with the idea that we need to be on every social network at once, master multiple skills, have multiple income streams, cultivate multiple social circles, pursue multiple interests with equal enthusiasm. The word multitasking was even treated as a desirable competency, until neuroscience demonstrated that the human brain does not perform multiple cognitive tasks simultaneously. It switches rapidly between them, paying a quality cost with every switch. What we call multitasking is most of the time an expensive and inefficient way of doing several things poorly at once. The most important question, then, is not whether you should concentrate your forces, because the answer is almost always yes. The question is, concentrate where? And this is where Law 23 demands the most difficult exercise of all, which is not one of discipline, but of discernment. Identifying the decisive point, that place where concentration will generate a disproportionate effect, requires a level of self-knowledge and environmental awareness that most people never develop, because they are too busy reacting to every demand at once. Warren Buffett, who is perhaps the best contemporary case of this principle, often recounts an exercise he did with his personal pilot, Mike Flint. Buffett asked Flint to list his 25 most important professional goals. Flint listed them. Buffett then asked him to circle the 5 most important. Flint circled them. Buffett then said, "The 20 that remain, the B list, are not your second priority. They are your list of things to avoid at all costs, because they are seductive enough to consume your time and energy without ever leading you to the level of excellence that the top 5 demand. That is the hedgehog in action. It is not about ignoring everything except one thing. It is about recognizing that the items on the B list are dangerous precisely because they are good enough to seem worth pursuing, when in fact they function as energy dispersers that prevent concentration on what truly matters. There is also a temporal dimension to this law that few commentators on Greene adequately explore, and which is worth unfolding carefully. The concentration of forces is not merely a strategy of space, it is a strategy of time. It is not enough to concentrate your resources on a single front. You must concentrate them at the right moment. The Rothschilds did not merely concentrate on information speed. They waited patiently for decades for that advantage to become irreversible before making the decisive move. Hannibal spent years building his army and studying the behavioral patterns of the Romans before assembling the pincer at Cannae. The strategist who concentrates too early exposes their single strong point before it is mature enough to be decisive. This also explains what generals called the powder burner, the soldier who spent all his energy at the start of the march and arrived exhausted at the battlefield. Premature concentration is just another form of dispersion. There is still one final aspect of this law that makes it particularly powerful and particularly difficult. Concentration of forces requires that you accept temporary vulnerability on other fronts. Hannibal left his center pulled back, apparently weak, so that his wings could close. Had the Romans recognized the maneuver and attacked the wings instead of advancing through the center, Cannae might have ended very differently. The Rothschilds concentrated on information and government financing, deliberately setting aside opportunities in other areas. Michelangelo refused projects that would have drawn him away from his central concentration. Each of them was, at some level, making a bet, accepting that the exposed flank was the necessary price for the depth achieved at the point of concentration. And that acceptance, that willingness to be vulnerable in some places in order to be invincible at the point that matters, is what separates those who truly understand Law 23 from those who have merely read it. Because most people who know this principle still do not apply it, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of courage to accept the vulnerability that accompanies the choice. Choosing where to concentrate means choosing where not to be, and not being somewhere feels, to the anxious eye, like weakness, like carelessness, like unnecessary risk. What history shows repeatedly, at Cannae, in the Rothschilds, in Michelangelo, in Buffett, is that this apparent vulnerability is precisely what enables real strength where it matters most.
So the question with which I want to close is not philosophical. It is practical, and it is urgent. Looking at where you are right now, professionally, artistically, strategically, where are you dispersing energy that should be concentrated? I'm not asking about the list of bad things you do. I'm asking about Buffett's B list, the things good enough to seem valuable, important enough to consume your time, but that in the end prevent you from reaching the level of concentration that transforms competence into real force. What is your decisive point? What is the magnifying glass that, if you aimed it with sufficient consistency at a single place, would be capable of causing an ignition? The law does not say you must be poor at everything except one thing. It says there is a qualitative difference between doing many things competently and doing one thing with a depth that makes you irreplaceable. And that difference is not one of talent. It is one of choice. It is the willingness to accept that concentrating is always, at some level, a bet, and that the only alternative to that bet is the slow, silent guarantee of scattered mediocrity. Hannibal returned to Carthage after Cannae. He never conquered Rome, despite having been only days' march from the city. History has its ironies. But the Battle of Cannae remained, not as the defeat of Rome, because Rome survived and Carthage eventually fell. It remained as the most perfect demonstration the ancient world ever produced of a timeless principle. That force, concentrated at the right point, at the right moment, with the courage to accept the vulnerability that focus demands, produces a result that no scattered numerical superiority can ever replicate. That principle does not belong to the 3rd century before Christ. It belongs to right now. And the only question that matters is what you are going to do with it.